Hello, this is Reverend Dr. Chris Wilson, and we are at our final session today on our study of the Gospel of Matthew, looking at the rabbinical qualities of Jesus and the structure of the Gospel itself. It's been a meaningful series for me to share with you. I hope it's been meaningful to you. This final session 6, we'll look at the last major teaching discourse that Jesus has in the Gospel of Matthew. It is often titled the Judgment Discourse, which is a little bit larger material, much like the Sermon on the Mount was 3 chapters. This final discourse is chapters 23 through 25. So we have 3 chapters of this final teaching. And this particular teaching is pretty significant in terms of its location and content combined. Its location in the gospel, Matthew is 28 chapters in length, and this is 23, 24, 25. So it's right near the end. And essentially, when you get past chapter 25, you get the end of the section, you go dive into chapter 26, the first thing you find in chapter 26 is the plot to kill Jesus. I mean, it just, right as soon as he finishes teaching, we get that plot and arrest and all that kind of stuff happens pretty quickly after this final teaching. So this final teaching is much like a professor giving their last word at the end of the semester, their final kind of thing. Before we go, I got some significant things I want to pass on to you. That's what we get here in this final discourse is Jesus is passing on some final, I think, blend of warnings and stories that help the disciples understand the future implications of their life. And they are in an intense week in Jerusalem. They've encountered authorities like they never have. Before this, they had not been in Jerusalem before. In the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, this is their first time in Matthew's gospel to be in Jerusalem, in the significant city of their people. And they are surrounded by many that are not liking the things that are being communicated out of Jesus' mouth. They don't like some of the activities and behaviors of Jesus. And because they are a part of his movement, the eyes are on them as well. And so this judgment discourse is kind of pushing them to the limits of, okay, I said this work was going to be demanding, and now you're really going to understand what that demand is all about. Your desire saying, I want to be a disciple of you, Jesus, we're going to find out how far you're willing to go to stay true to that statement. That's how important these final few chapters are in this last teaching discourse that Jesus offers to his listeners. The 3 chapters unfold. I've got a slide I want to show early on in this particular session today. Gene Boring kind of does a breakdown of chapters 23, 24, and 25. And what's kind of interesting is that chapter 23 is the disciples in a wider audience. And then chapters 24 and 25 is just the disciples. And so you have, in this teaching, you have kind of 2 parts. Chapter 23 is to a wider audience. Chapter 24, 25 is to a more intimate audience. The wider audience, the words that are heard But I think Jesus is ratcheting up the intensity of discipleship. And one of the things we discern, that discipleship can't be delayed, that discipleship is meant to be lived in the moment. There is no waiting. You're either a disciple now or you're just not a disciple. You don't get to I'll be a disciple in a few days, or I'll be a disciple when it feels right. The other is the notion that Jesus pushes present moment over the future. If there's any hint of something down the line, don't wait until down the line, is that the demands of discipleship are right now, in this moment. And you act now because this is what you believe. And I think that comes out true. So we have in these chapters this unknowing, compelling piece for not knowing the future. If we don't know the future, how do we live our current life? Jesus saying, because of the intensity of discipleship, you shouldn't worry about the future. If you trust in God, that's enough. If you believe in God, that's enough. And that should propel you to live in the present moment with more urgency. It escalates readiness. It heightens our dedication and work for doing God's work in the world. It pushes the believer for the present moment rather than an ultimate future, which is so contrast to many people out there today. Their sense of being a believer of the Christian movement is they want to make sure that they're going to get to heaven. That's their big worry is the future. I tend to not look at it that way. I really don't worry about heaven, or I tend to not worry about what's going to happen to me after I die. I mean, there's a lot of mystery about what happens to us after we die. I simply just trust that whatever happens when I die, God will take care of me. All I can control, I can't control what's down the line. All I can control, even if you can call it control, all I can manage is what I'm doing right now. That's all I can do within my purview in terms of sharing my faith. And that's what it comes down to. You get to the final piece of chapter 25, and you have the infamous story of the separation of the sheep and the goats. And I love the part in the parable where the person says, when was it that we were supposed to see you naked and hungry and in prison? And he said, when you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. One of the fascinating things about this parable in terms of who is welcomed in, who's brought in at the right hand of God, it's not what they believed, it was how they lived. There wasn't anything in that story, that final story of the separation of the sheep and goats, that had nothing to do about what their beliefs were. It had more to do with what their actions were all about. I often heard the phrase, actions speak louder than words. It doesn't mean that our beliefs aren't important. Our beliefs typically push us to behave in certain ways. And we want those behaviors to be up front and center in terms of our discipleship. When there are places of justice in the world, we might believe certain things about justice, but if we're not living out that justice, our words become hollow. If we want our words to be full and vibrant, then our words and our activities in the world must match one another. And that's really what Jesus is passing on in this final judgment discourse through all these things. The parable of the talents. Don't sit on what God's given you. God's given you all these tremendous gifts. Go and live them and multiply them and spread them in ways that others can encounter and experience this grace that God offers to all of us. And these warnings, these stories at the end, this judgment is really more of a pushing than Jesus judging us. He is kind of pushing and urging us into deep, dedicated activity to get into the world and make a difference in the world. And the thing I love about that final story, the sheep and the goats, is it's kind of that mystery of who do we care for? And the idea of, when was it that we saw you? I didn't see you. I didn't see you. It's the idea is that we shouldn't have judging eyes on people, that every single person is a gift in God's creation. Should be treated with dignity and with care and compassion. We should treat each person in the world as though they are the most important person on this planet. If we treat each person with that great care, then we will be embodying the very kingdom Jesus said was happening right now. It gets us past saying things like, wouldn't it be great if the world was like this? Well, the world can be like this if we behave what we believe. The teaching of this final discourse is under the premise that true knowing is only as important as true acting. If we're honest with ourselves, one cannot fully know all of who God is or what God wants. One can only seek to be faithful and humble in our sharing of what we know of God's love. What we read about God's love, what we experience about God's love. All we can do is be faithful and humble to embodying God's love in the world. There was an important mentor in my life that had a statement that has continued to ring true for me for many of the years of my life. And the saying that he passed on to me was this. He said, the Christian person will do the best they can with what they have, share with others to do the same thing, and to leave the results in God's hands. Relinquish control. Do the very best with God has given you. Some days will be better than other days, but we strive to be the very best we can be for God in that moment and encourage others to do the same. And we just have to leave the results to God in the end. We are called to be faithful. And in that faithfulness is not just what we think, but how we live. That's what this final discourse gets at. And then, as the last word is spoken, the plot for Jesus' arrest begins in the unfolding of the upper room, the garden, the arrest, the torture, the death on the cross. This final discourse calls us to be vulnerable to a God and to one another. This is the unconditional love modeled to us by Jesus in this discourse and all the other discourses and his entire ministry, even his death on the cross. These 5 discourses that Jesus teaches throughout the Gospel of Matthew, the rabbinical qualities that he passes on through each of these discourses is ultimately our vulnerability to a demanding discipleship in a world that is longing for significance and purpose. A few final notes before we close out this series and this study. Is Discourse 1, chapters 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. It is discipleship transformed. Individuals learning what discipleship is all about. Discourse 2, chapter 10, sharing that discipleship. Not just keeping it internal, but spreading it, sharing it, making it available to others. The third discourse we had in chapter 13, the parables, is what the kingdom of God is like and how do we live in it? How do we embody that kingdom? The fourth discourse, which is chapter 18, which is the community discourse, is how we understand our communal life as organized believers? What are the relational traits that allow us to be true community with one another and for God? And this final discourse in 23, 24, and 25 is our future with God is shared by present moment discipleship. Our future is really our present. I want to thank you for joining us for these 6 sessions as we've had at least a window into Matthew's gospel and some of Matthew's rabbinical qualities and how Jesus embodies that rabbinical style. That these 5 major teaching moments in Matthew's gospels is such a unique structure and really mirrors all of how the rest of the gospel unfolds. As I shared early on, that these 5 major teaching moments represent 1/3 of Matthew's gospel. We have to pay attention to these 5 teaching moments of Jesus because they shape not only who Jesus was, but it shapes who the disciples become, and it shapes who we become as disciples of Jesus as well. Thank you for joining us on this Gospel of Matthew journey.